Thanks everyone for coming tonight and for having me. I'm gonna just switch up my screen here real quick. I was saying to Katie beforehand, it's a little weird now doing talks like these. Is you just sit here and talk to your computer and you hope people are listening. I guess I'll find out at the very end. But again, thanks everyone for having me tonight. I'm gonna talk about a project that I did over the last year. It was actually a great pandemic project. We were approached by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their archaeologists there, and to analyze a collection of projectile points that they've been collecting for about 10 years or so off of this site down in the San Luis Valley. And it was a great little lab project, and that site is called the Scott Miller site, and we'll dive into that. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is about the projectile points there, kind of some chronology, and then zero in on one particular piece of the project that we did for the projectile points, and that's called the Oshara Tradition, and I'll explain what that means later on in the talk. But before I get too far into anything, I just want to acknowledge a few folks that were involved in this project, both what I did, but also that the work that led to what I did. And first and foremost is Meg Van Ness, and I see right now I have a typo, but there's a space in her last name. But Meg is the Regional Historic Preservation Officer for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Fantastic individual, and was really helpful in gathering some data for this project and having us do it in the first place. And then some previous researchers at the site. Robert Wunderlich and the team at RMC Consultants, Marilyn Martirano and others, they did kind of the bulk of the work. I'll talk about Steve Holen and Jared Beaton and some volunteers from Adams State University and other folks. Worked with them also at the site, and they contributed to the collection that I analyzed. And then as I was diving into the work and realized that there's a huge Oshara tradition component to the projectile points, I reached out to a gentleman, Dr. Nicholaschapin and Brad Vieira. Both have done a ton of work on the Archaic period in northern New Mexico, and they shared with me a lot of thoughts and their research, and so they were a huge help as I did this project, and want to thank them. And last but certainly not least, my wife, who when I told her I was going to do this, just let out a big sigh, and so she's currently at home battling bedtime with a couple young kids, so I could be here with you. So thanks to her. So just want to situate us a little bit. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the San Luis Valley, but it's in southern Colorado. It's that the San Luis Valley proper is kind of that yellow area right there in the middle of the map. You can see I've labeled Pueblo and Trinidad to the east, and Gunnison northwest, and then Pagosa Springs to the southwest. But the San Luis Valley is a massive area in south central Colorado. It looks flat and low, but it's actually quite high there. Those mountains ringing it, are part of the Sangre de Cristos on the eastern flank there, and the Uncompahgre and San Juan's to the west. So the valley bottom is something like 8,000 feet above sea level. So while it looks flat and low, it's actually pretty high. And since 2009, the organization that I work for, Paleocultural Research Group, we've been doing a number of projects down in the valley, and just have them called out there, kind of in the northwest corner of those three dots up there are some residential structures and sites we worked on in the early teens. We've done some work down in the South Valley, some big surveys along the Rio Grande and the Rio Grande natural area. Beautiful area. I have a picture at the end that you'll get to see how beautiful it is if you haven't been there, and various other projects kind of throughout the valley and adjacent to the valley. So we've got done a ton of work down there. We're building on what others have done, but also really trying to make some inroads on what's happening in valley archaeology. And the most recent project we did is that dot right there in the middle, and that's 2021. This past summer, we did worked at a project at a site, excuse me, that's very much like the one that I'll be talking about tonight. That's called the Mr. Peat site. So, give you a little background on the San Luis Valley and the history there. Some of the earliest peoples that came to North America lived in the valley. Clovis folks, people that were using Clovis points, lived in the valley. They occupied the valley. In fact, the only and first and only Clovis point that I've ever seen in the field was in the San Luis Valley. So people have been there since practically the beginning of time, right? There's major Folsom sites, these big bison kills, the Stewart's Cattle Guard site down by the dunes, and big campsites. And actually, I think Kelton Meyer, who's a PhD candidate at Colorado State University, is going to be talking to you guys at some point in the near future about his work at the Redden site, which is a really neat Folsom site down there. And so if you find that archaeology interesting, definitely tune in to Kelton's talk. So major Folsom camps, and then occupations during the Archaic, or what you will see I'm going to call the Oshara, to the Late Prehistoric. Repeated occupations. People were living in the valley. It wasn't just, they weren't poking in and hanging out and leaving. There, folks living there year round. Those two pictures at the bottom are Late Prehistoric residential structures that we worked. The one on the right, that kind of the aerial image of one, that's at a site called the Upper Crossing site, which is near and dear to my heart. But Late Prehistoric residential structures. The other pictures from a site called Mill Creek. And we actually found some black and white pottery there. So, perhaps some Pueblo folks coming in, but people have been using the valley for quite some time, up to the present day, right? Historic Native American. I've got historic Native American, historic in quotes there, and I guess I'm just trying to highlight that's our term for it, but they're people, and this is their culture and their history, and their ancestors have been living in the valley and using the valley for hundreds and thousands of years. But folks were, camping there, living there, hunting there, using it to travel. There's some, accounts in journals talking about Ute folks moving from the reservations, coming across the valley, going over the Sangres and down into the plains to hunt bison. So, point being, people have been in the valley and using the valley for quite some time. And then we've got Spanish and American exploration and settlement, Pike Gunnison, Fremont, among many others, exploring, traversing through the valley. And then early trails, the Old Spanish National Historic Trail, the North Branch goes through the valley, and the map I have there, that kind of gray line running up through southern Colorado, that goes right on the kind of the west flank of the east flank of the valley. We've PCRG, we've done some work at a few OST related sites over the years. There's railroad, agriculture, so the valley is a popular place for many folks. All right, so switching gears a little bit, the Scott Miller site is located on that black dot. Just a bit south of the Rio Grande, on the west side of the valley. And what it is today looks like, slides aren't advanced. There we go. That's the Scott Miller site today. Now, take a shot of us at this site today. I'm giving you the presentation, and I'm telling you, people lived in this area and used the resources here, 12,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and there's teeming with people and wildlife. And you'd think I was nuts, because today it's kind of a barren, gnarly, ugly looking landscape in many ways. It's a relic wetland is what we call it, and it's now a dried up peat bog. But back in the day, it would have been teeming with vegetation, lush vegetation, wildlife. But today you can see, the dried up peat. And what, I tried to find some corollaries to what it may have looked like in the past. And just gathered some few photos, and courtesy of Meg Van Ness took some of these shots. But this, potentially is about what the Scott Miller site would have looked at from time to time. So again, a relic wetland. The landscape probably kind of changed depending on water and different environmental factors and climatic factors over the years, but gives you a rough idea of what it looked like. Now, the history of work at the site doesn't go back that far. I think the site is probably known to artifact collectors for quite some time. If there's one thing the valley is known for, it's having pretty extensive, intensive collectors. People were out hunting artifacts. It was kind of a thing you did on the weekends. You'd go to church on Sunday and pack a picnic lunch and head out to some sites and go hunting and pick up artifacts. And that was the way things were then. And in some ways, some folks still do it now. We don't encourage that by any means, but that was just kind of how things were. But so collectors surely knew about this place for quite some time. But in 2009, Meg Van Ness from the Fish and Wildlife Service recorded the site. There was a project that was a water project that was going to happen there, and the biologist, a guy named Scott Miller, imagine that, visited the area in advance of doing kind of his water project and notified Meg and said, "Yeah, I think there's something out there. You might want to go take a look." And Meg went down, and she has a funny line about saying, "Well, Scott, that water project? No, I don't think it's going to happen," because she discovered some pretty extensive archaeology, most of which was sitting on the surface, but tons of projectile points and some groundstone and a whole number of things. I'll show you some photos here in a sec. But and then in 2012, so Meg did kind of the initial recording. It was actually a couple different sites at her time, but that's neither here nor there. Turns into one big site. In 2012, again, that Robert Wunderlich and Marilyn Martirano and their team at RMC Consultants got some money from the State Historical Fund, the Colorado State Historical Fund, and did an assessment project there and did a full recording analysis, established a site boundary, and made a bunch of collections, many of which are included in what I'm going to talk about later on this evening. And in 2016, Steve Holen from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and Jared Beaton, who at the time was a professor at Adams State University, he's now down at Fort Lewis College. He's a geoarchaeologist. They were interested in finding early human association with Pleistocene megafauna, right? So mammoths, mastodons, and that was kind of their focus. And peat bog site that had some mammoth bone. They knew it had mammoth bone, so they were hot on it, and they went down and dug a bunch of backhoe trenches and tried to find some mammoth bone and with cut marks or some clear association with people. But they did not. They found a lot of mammoth bone and a lot of other things, but no clear association between humans and Pleistocene megafauna, at least at Scott Miller. They've got a few other sites in the valley that may have some association. And then over the years, Meg and others have visited the site, done some monitoring, checked the condition, led tours, all of which has led to continuing to collect artifacts to this day. In fact, some of the numbers I'm going to present to you tonight are now expired, if you will. Meg notified me over the summer that she went down and led a tour and found 7 or 8 more points just in a day. So things keep popping up at this site. It's gonna be one of those places where I guess the gift that keeps on giving, if you will. So what's at the site? Obviously projectile points, right? That's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. But give you a quick kind of overview of some other things they found. Right? So over 200 projectile points. About 25 pieces of groundstone that includes handstones and basin stones, or manos and metates. Over 80 pottery sherds. Pottery, I've looked at some of it. It's not much to shake your fist at, but it's there. Over 400 flakes, which sound like a lot, and surely there's more there. But when you compare that to the number of projectile points, you, as an archaeologist, you kind of sort of cock your head a little bit. There's just not as many flakes as you would expect for the number of projectile points. About another 100 or so other stone tools, and that's from the 2012 summary. Again, there's more that has since been found, but it's kind of hard to quantify all of it without having a good database. So the long and short of it is there's Native American artifacts at this site that span from about 12,500 years ago to 200, 250 years ago, somewhere in that frame. So this site is pretty unique in that respect, not just for the valley, but kind of overall to have this. I wouldn't say repeated occupation. That's a little misleading, but and so is continuous occupation. But people keep coming back to this particular place, this resource, over and over again for 12,000 years, which is pretty impressive. So I wanted just to give you a little bit of a framework to think about what I'm gonna kind of talk about for the rest of the night, and in terms of hunter-gatherer theory. And I'm just gonna glide on top of the surface of some of this, but I just want to give you a little framework in terms of how archaeologists try to think about some of these things. And a lot of hunter-gatherer theory, in many ways goes back to Dr. Lou Binford, who is an archaeologist from the 50s and 60s and 70s, 80s, but really is best known for doing a lot of theory and thinking about hunter-gatherers and how hunter-gatherers operate on the landscape, and doing participant observation and observing people. And Lou's in that picture in the bottom, in the plaid shirt there, and at a real high level, there's foragers and collectors, and again, I'm glancing on top of the surface, but I'm gonna do my best to kind of just give you a little bit of meat to chew on, to again, as a framework to kind of think about some of the things. So foragers, these are residentially mobile groups. These are groups that as a unit move from resource to resources. So the way Bob Kelly talks about this is moving consumers to food, right? So you have your people, and say you're berry hunters, and that's all you do. And that's not true, but just to again couch it in a little bit of a easy way to think about it. You're moving from berry patch to berry patch, and you start at one berry patch, and you exhaust that resource, and you take everybody and you move to the next berry patch, and you exhaust that resource and you move to the next one. So many residential moves, frequent relocation, right? You're kind of constantly moving about the landscape. You have your daily needs, your hunting and gathering, is occurring each day, but your foraging radius, your range is quite restricted. Now, contrast that with what Binford calls, collectors. This is logistical mobility, whereas the way I think Bob Kelly does a good job of doing the consumer and food analogy, but it's the food is moving to the consumers. So you have people that are logistically mobile. There's people within your group that go out and get the things that your group needs, and they bring them back, while people at the base camp are doing other tasks. Infrequent relocation, few residential moves. So you're not moving everybody all the time. You have storage. You're caching and saving things for later use. That could be food, but it could also be tools. Right? If you have a good area where you can get a bunch of nuts, maybe you would leave your groundstone there rather than schlepping it around all the time. In a larger foraging range. So bringing it back up just to give you a moment to kind of compare and contrast those two modes of hunter-gatherer life ways, if you will. The thing to realize, and to not blunt you with more information, but this is a spectrum, right? These are two ends of the spectrum. There's a lot in between that's happening, and a lot of these, probably boil down to economic choices, right? There's certain times of the year where it makes sense to kind of root yourself into one spot and be follow the forager strategy, where you're sitting in the valley, for instance, and in the San Luis Valley, for instance, and it's cold there, right? It's high, and in the wintertime, it's not. I mean, it's not a bad place to be, but it's not living on the beach in LA, right? So maybe at certain times of the year, it makes sense to adopt one strategy, and at other times of the year, in the summertime, hey, let's move up to the high country and bring everybody, and we'll go, get berries and whatnot. So we're living on a spectrum, but this is just a bit of a framework to think about the Scott Miller site and how it was used, and the things that I'm going to talk about here in the next 15 minutes or so. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about some fun stuff. So the projectile point assemblage, again, came to me from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We got all of the chipstone collection, and step one was myself and one of our undergraduate work study students, a woman named Reagan Hurt, who's now a graduate student up in Wisconsin. She and I went through this collection and pulled out anything and everything that could be a projectile point, possibly maybe be a projectile point. Then that was kind of phase 0, if you will. And then phase 1, I went through and removed some from that, and what we were left with was 219 projectile points in this assemblage. And give you a snapshot there of what some of the points look like. I'll show you some more good shots here in a bit, but wanted to just highlight this map real quick. I'm gonna come back to it, but you can see the distribution of projectile points on that map there, and just ignore the distribution for a moment. Again, towards the end, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that, but think about the area. Look at that scale. That's 400 meters. So from kind of the southwest to the northeast, it's over 1 kilometer long, and the widest part, kind of moving northwest to southeast, is also about a kilometer or so. So this is a pretty big area that we're talking about, and like I said, initially it was a few different sites that over time just kind of merged and morphed into one site. So what's there? Well, there's some PaleoIndian points, right? I talked about the site being occupied since about 12,500 years ago or so. There's one Folsom point. You can see a picture of it there, the top row. There's those are the Folsom points. There's just one, and it's a midsection. So most projectile points, in order to assign them a type and age, we need the base. We need some kind of key pieces of information to clue into, to go, yeah, that's this type, not that type. But Folsom points are a bit unique in that you could have a midsection just like that. So we're not looking at a full point. We're looking at just the middle of it. But that distinctive flute there, right in the middle, if you can see that particularly on the image on the left, that's characteristic Folsom technology. The edging is also very characteristic, but there's just one, which is interesting, particularly in the valley, as like I mentioned, the work that Kelton Meyer is doing at the Redden site, and Peggy Jodry and Dennis Stanford at Stuart Cattleguard, and many other Paleo-Indian sites. There's a lot of Paleo-Indian archaeology in the valley, so it's a little curious that there's just one Folsom point here. Could be potentially a collector issue. Like I said, a lot of collectors in the valley, and that Folsom points are very diagnostic, so that could be something. But there's just one. There's 2 agate basin points, so kind of just a little after, or kind of somewhat overlapping to just a little after the Folsom era is agate basin. Again, very distinctive projectile points. There's 2 of those, and then there's 2 plain view Paleo-Indian points. And you can see I've got the date ranges there just to give you a rough idea. And there's a couple that are maybe Hell Gap, a little later Paleo-Indian type. They were super fragmented and really hard to type, and I got a little gun shy on definitely calling them Hell Gap, but probably so. Then fast forwarding 10,000 years or more, there's an arrow point collection there also. So we identified 27 arrow points. These included 19 corner notched arrows. So bow and arrow technology kind of replaces dart technology. About 150 AD, give or take a little. There's probably some overlap. And the earliest arrow points are these corner notched arrow points, but there's a big variation in the styles at Scott Miller sites. I'm showing you kind of the range there. Then there's 7 side notched arrow points. So these are a little bit later in time. The progression is corner notched to side notched arrows. There's 7 of those, and there's 1 arrow point fragment that's just too fragmented. It's definitely an arrow point, I know that, but it's too fragmented to type. And an additional 14 points are in the assemblage, but they're so broken that we couldn't assign any age range to them. So I've talked about PaleoIndian points. There's 5 to 8 of those. Talked about arrow points. There's 27 of those, but I said there was 219 points at the very beginning, right? So what are the rest? Well, those are dart points, or the Oshara Tradition dart points. And the Oshara Tradition, I'll talk a little bit more here in a bit, is roughly equivalent to the Archaic period. So post-Paleo-Indian, late prehistoric, this kind of roughly 5,500 year span of time. And what I found when I was going through the analysis, I wanted to kind of try and normalize things a little bit to see, like, gosh, it seems like there's a lot of Oshara Tradition points, but is that just because it's a longer time span? But as you can see here on this little table that I have, I've normalized it by points per 100 years. So, a Paleo-Indian person dropped a point, dropped 0.2 of a point every 100 years, right? That doesn't really work, but you get the idea. Contrasted with the Oshara Tradition, where we're looking at 3.1, so orders of magnitude more frequent for our Oshara Tradition points. So really the story of Scott Miller and the story that I'm going to kind of talk about for the rest of the night is the Oshara Tradition and the Oshara Tradition points. So what is the Oshara Tradition? Well, it started out of Cynthia Irwin Williams in 1973, publishing this book here, The Oshara Traditions, Origins of Anasazi Culture. And her Cynthia Irwin Williams's intent was to establish a pre-Puebloan sequence for northern New Mexico. Right, by this point in the 70s, pretty good sequence of events for Puebloan archaeology, and they're working on some Paleo-Indian, but she wanted to kind of fill in that gap, kind of pre-Puebloan archaeology, and that's what she did. Cynthia Irwin Williams, a lot of you guys might know her from Magic Mountain. She did that. She actually started at Lodeshka, which is just south of Magic Mountain. She's the first. She grew up in college from Colorado, and got hooked in with Marie Warmington at Denver, what is now the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and did some archaeology, and then went to graduate school at Harvard, and was the first woman anthropology PhD from Harvard in the 60s, and again is probably most well known around these parts for her work at the Magic Mountain site and the Lodeshka site, and establishing these long sequences of projectile point typologies there. But flipping back to the Oshara Tradition, this was something that she worked on again to establish this pre-Puebloan sequence, roughly to the Archaic period, or roughly 6,000 to 1,600 BP. It wasn't all original. She incorporated some type names from other folks, and kind of collapsed a few different sequences that others had done, and tried to organize it. But one thing that I think has been lost over time is her intent was never to necessarily establish a projectile point typology. She wasn't trying to have the be all and end all of the types sequence, the projectile point sequence for northern New Mexico. But over the years, it's been used that way, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But really, she was trying to establish phases and comprising different point types. Points do change over time, and they can stylistically be linked to certain periods. But she was doing that and talking about other material culture, right? Again, it's this pre-Puebloan archaeology and what's happening, right? Puebloan archaeology, you've got pottery and pueblos and all sorts of things, and she's trying to figure out what's happening before that. So in 2005, a guy named Nicholaschapin, I mentioned him at the very beginning, wrote his dissertation trying to kind of revisit what Cynthia Irwin Williams had done with the Oshara tradition, but actually make a typology out of it, formalize what she didn't really try to do, and make that more relevant to what archaeologists kind of use it for. So he did his dissertation in 2005 from the University of New Mexico, and then in 2017 published this volume here, Oshara Revisited, that you can order online from the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. So again, it's rooted in New Mexico. That's kind of where the sequence comes from. Again, a pre-Puebloan sequence that he was trying to do. He utilized some prior names, types, and built on existing data to kind of refine the terminology and the typology and the dating that Cynthia Irwin Williams didn't really have access to a lot of those. But in contrast to her, like I said, he was trying to make a typology. He did make a typology. That was his whole point. And just give you a typology is it's making projectile points and assigning them types based on morphological or metric characteristics, and assigning those types to a name and then an age range. And I'll give you a good example here on the next slide. Chapin has this. I put this flow chart up. That's kind of the decision tree that he developed, that I used throughout this whole analysis. And it has stem points and notch points, and then you look at the base shape, and then you look at the edge angle. And so, to a degree, it seems scientific, and you break it down, and you take measurements, and you do all this, and boom. But in reality, there's a lot of variability in some of this, and you have to make some judgment calls and look at kind of the bigger picture. And what Chapin has done is he's made multiple series with types within the series. And again, I'll show you a picture here in a sec. The chronology is pretty good, best it's ever been, but there's a lot of kind of still sort of gray areas. We need more sites with more of these points that we can confidently date. That's kind of the one thing that's lacking, is the chronology and the temporal piece of all of this. We have some rough ideas, but it could be better. But again, it's the best it's ever been. So at the Scott Miller site, right, 104 definite Oshara tradition points, no doubt. Those are Oshara tradition points. I've got this table that kind of walks through the main series types, and then on the opposite side is a poster that Chapin sent to me that he had made, and this ended up being my Bible. It's sitting right behind me, hanging on my wall. I was looking at it. I look at it every day, so I mentioned he made this series, so you can see on the left-hand column of that, he's got from the top to the bottom, the En Medio series, the Augustin series, the Armijo series, Moquino, San Jose, Bajada. So those are the series, but then within that, so for instance, the Armijo series, he's got 3 different types: the Armijo corner notched, the Armijo stemmed, and the Armijo side notched. And so his decision tree that I showed you in the previous slide, walks you through to make a decision on is it an Armijo side notched or is it an Armijo stem? That's actually a bad example, but using different measurements and styles and base shapes, you can make a judgment call. While that's good and valid, I started to really kind of not question the methodology behind it, but again, there's a lot of variability, and archaeologists, we sometimes divide ourselves into camps. There's lumpers, where we include a wide range of variation, or splitters, where we're well, this is 0.01 millimeters shorter than that, so therefore it's another type. Bit of an extreme example, but you hopefully get what I'm saying. And so I've typed all of these to their Armijo corner notched, or Moquino concave, or the Grant San Jose. I've used all those types, but on the back end of the analysis, the sample size was so small for each one of those little types that it was hard to do much with. So I kind of rewound it back up into their series, and that's how I present and talk about the data for the rest of this talk and in the report that I wrote. So switching over to that table there, you can see there's three kind of pulses where there's each series of the Oshara tradition is represented. I have J3 question mark. J is an interesting topic for the Oshara. We could spend an entire evening talking about it and really still have no answer. So we're just gonna set J aside for a bit. But it's kind of it's either the earliest piece of the Oshara, or it's some variation of later Paleo-Indian. And is that really even meaningful? Probably not. But J is early. It's earlier than the others. Beyond that, it's tough to say too much at this point. But again, all of the Oshara series are represented, but the San Jose, the Armijo, and the En Medio are the two that have most well represented. And towards the end of the talk, I'll show you kind of how those are distributed on the site, and talk about some reasons why that may be. Excuse me. And the last thing I'll say, there's 64 dart points. They're definitely dart points, but they're, again, too fragmented. They didn't have the characteristics, the things that I needed to measure or observe in order to make a call using Chapin's decision tree. So at the very outset of the analysis, one of the major questions that we had, right, that we wanted to answer, we wanted to get an idea of what the collection was, but as a researcher, you want to go beyond, like, what is it? So one of the major questions that we were trying to ask, what are they doing here? The answer sort of seems obvious, right? They're hunting, right? Duh. But is it more complicated than that? Is there more going on? Right, and think back to that collector-forager discussion we had, right? Are these logistical groups showing up here? Is there a base camp, right there, and they're just taking advantage of the whole landscape that they have to offer? Now, projectile points, just one piece of that story. They are quite informative. They help us tell time. They help us talk about what folks were doing, after the hunt. Were they manufacturing points? Were they refurbishing points? Were they pulling out, broken stubs and leaving them there? So the portion that's represented can be super informative. So a whole lot of things that we can learn. The type of break, the fracture on the point can also be very informative. So for the Oshara tradition points themselves, there's 25% or 26 of them are complete. They're unbroken or very mildly broken. And I consider those more or less probably hunting losses. Right? They took a shot and they missed, or they took a shot and it was in the meat, and they, or what have you, and it was in the guts, and when they were butchering the animal, it stayed behind. So 26 complete points. Then there's 69 that have clear impact fractures. These are points that usually, impact fractures are generally fairly distinct, and I have a pretty conservative approach to coding that. For you experts out there, I realized that I have an agate basin point here for the Oshara tradition, that the one on the top right is that's that agate basin point I showed earlier, but it's got a great example of an impact fracture, so I was trying to show you that. But so save your emails. but they leave these distinct fractures. So 66% of the Oshara tradition points have impact fractures. So right now we're talking about a huge proportion of the Oshara tradition where they're either hunting losses or broken from impact, right? Almost all of it, which is huge, and very interesting. Overall, for the collection, 78.5% of the points were discarded due to use. So I coded a whole number of other variables, fracture type. There's more fracture types than just impact fracture, but I kind of collapsed all of those. And so for, again, this is arrow points, unknown dart points, paleo points. We're talking 78.5% were discarded due to use, and just over 19% were due to manufacturing failures. So what does that tell us? They're there to hunt. They're not doing a whole lot of other activities. Typically, you'd expect to see some more camp evidence, even in the projectile points, broken little stubs, maintenance failures. You're resharpening it and you break it off. There's some of that for sure, but not a whole lot of it. What about where were these people getting their raw materials? The valley has itself has some raw material sources, but not too many to shake your fist at. There's a quartzite source in the north of the Rio Grande near Sawatch. There's some sources kind of in the South Valley. The sangres are pretty void of flakable stone. But just south of you, across the state line, which of course didn't exist 5,000 years ago, but down in New Mexico, there's obsidian, and at the Scott Miller site, particularly in the Oshara tradition points, there's a fair bit of obsidian. So we're seeing, again, obsidian from New Mexico. A lot of the obsidian was sourced in the 2012 analysis. I didn't do any sourcing myself, but a lot of it was sourced to New Mexico sources. There's other southern sources like dacite, again, these volcanics, basalt, also most likely from New Mexico or South San Luis Valley. And then there's some western sources, some cherts and rhyolites that probably come from the west, volcanics and whatnot. So for the Oshara tradition, and really for the assemblage almost as a whole, we're seeing pretty clear evidence of a southern raw material zone, which would lead one to presume that people are coming from the south and they're moving north. They acquire their materials south and they're moving up north. There are some sources, some raw material sources that we know of from the north. I mentioned that quartzite, that Trickle Mountain quartzite. There's Trout Creek chert up by Buena Vista, really great high quality chert. In the Oshara tradition, though, there's basically nothing that we can readily or easily identify as coming from the north. So again, this southern kind of projectile point typology, the sequence that's definitely known in New Mexico, is definitely kind of rooted in New Mexico, is showing up in just north of New Mexico in southern Colorado. The raw materials are there, so it's pretty safe to assume people are coming from the south. There is one PaleoIndian point, one of the Plainview points is most likely the Trout Creek chert from north of the valley. Pretty obviously identifiable, but that's it. So I told you I'd come back to this map, and again, I wanted to highlight the size of the site that we're talking about, kilometer by kilometer, plus or minus a little bit. But what I wanted to talk about here, and what I'm going to kind of shift towards for the end of the talk, is thinking spatially about the site, right? I can show you measurements and types and stuff, but for me, and what I like to think about is how did people use this landscape and what were they doing there? And I wanted to re-show this map and talk a little bit about that white box that I have highlighted there. And I have the elephant mounds next to it. And the elephant mounds is an ode to the Mammoth area. That's where this is the area where Steve Holland and Jared Beaton and their teams were looking for mammoths. There's been a lot of mammoth bone found in that area. But there's a ton of those black little dots, and each one of those black little dots represents a projectile point, right? And if you just, without even doing any spatial statistics or anything, you can say, well, there's a lot of points there. And I wanted to point out there's a reason for that. It could be that it was a great hunting ground and a little camp zone potentially. But an alternative or an additional explanation is definitely has to do with modern day archaeology. So the parking area is real close to that. So when Meg or others are out working at the site or leading tours or whatnot, you're parked there and you're basically walking through that area every single time. And I know Meg, she's always out with a GPS and some bags, so she's constantly going through that area. When you constantly go back and forth through one area, you're going to continue to find stuff, especially at a site like this where things just continually pop up. There's some sand, it's moving, things are getting exposed. And so that's the reason for, I think the reason for that distribution. I think there is probably something cultural to it as well, or it's a combination of factors. And I think more likely some of those blank areas, south of the concentration there, probably maybe have just as many points, but they just haven't been looked at as intensively, is my guess. So what about those three periods that I mentioned, the three phases, or series, the San Jose, Armijo, and Enmedio. So those span from about 5,000 to about 1,600 BP years ago, give or take. And I have this map up. Again, you see the concentration there where that Elephant Mounds was. And so those blue dots represent San Jose points. They're the earliest of those three. And then there's the Armijo points and those red squares, and then the Enmedio points in the yellow circles. So if you look at San Jose, gosh, they're almost all right on that northern zone. And then over time, it appears there's maybe expansion of areas of the site being used. I don't know. And then in the Enmedio, for sure, they're much more widely distributed and kind of scattered about. I've got some examples of those three different types down in the lower left. So it appears that spatial use of the site is expanding over time. These three series are 77 of the 104 typable Oshara points. So they make up the bulk of the typable Oshara collection. So they're informative in terms of changing use of the site, the spatial use of the site over time. Is that a changing landscape? This is a dynamic landscape. There's water moving in and out. Things are changing. It could, climatic, environmental factors are affecting all sorts of other variables that could be changing. Where's super mucky and you can't get, or where's super mucky and you want to, run the bison into where they can't move and they're easy prey. Or is it some other process? One thing to note: these three series, the San Jose, the Armijo, and the Enmedio, are also the three series that have multiple types within them. So their definition is a little broad, perhaps more broad than some of the others. So there could be kind of some collection bias, but maybe a little analyst bias in there as well. So any number of things. But I wanted to, particularly in Enmedio, compare that distribution to the corner notched arrow points, which immediately post-date the Enmedio. You go from Enmedio to corner notched. In fact, Chapin, and I think he's right, kind of makes the point that Enmedio is this kind of weird crossover. There's some that sure kind of look like arrows, but they meet all the other definitions of Enmedio. And then there's some arrows that are like, ooh, man, that's kind of could be an Enmedio. So there's a little bit of crossover. And we see that with this transition from bow, from atlatl and dart technology to bow and arrow technology, where there's probably some experimentation, right? A major shift in your projectile technology is going to come with kind of a little bit of transition period, right? So looking at the distribution of corner notched arrow points compared to the Enmedio, I have this map and it shows the corner and side notched, and you see corner notched are also somewhat scattered about the landscape. So perhaps kind of some persistence in how the environment and the landscape was in existence from in medio to the late prehistoric period. But the kind of a caveat is it's a pretty small sample size, and there are definite collection biases happening at the site. So don't want to draw too many conclusions, but I think what the kind of the scattered distribution, particularly in the last map, shows is that landscape is changing over time, and people are adapting and using different parts of it, and we can play that out in the archaeology. All right, the Scott Miller site. So what did I just blabble on for 50 minutes about? I think I just blabbled on for 50 minutes about one of the cooler sites in the San Luis Valley. There aren't many, and I struggle to even name one. There's people out there that'll probably hit me over the head, but sites in the valley that show this depth of occupation. Right, early on I talked about they're not repeated occupations, not people coming back, but there's no really other way to think about it. They're probably not coming back every year and year and year, but people continue to come back to this particular spot on the landscape, and probably because it's a great place to hunt. There's the focus at the site is clearly these limited there's limited camp activities, and they're definitely there to hunt, and it remained that way for 12,000 years, which is pretty unique and pretty awesome, I think. Again, extensive occupations during the Oshara. I think I've hopefully made that point. Does that mean there's more frequent use during the Oshara period? People are coming back, every few years, every decade? Is it more intensive, but fewer occupations? They're doing a lot, but less frequently. We don't know. But again, the focus was clearly hunting, and I tasked you with a little bit of brain thought at the beginning of the talk with thinking about collector, forager. I think Scott Miller definitely follows kind of a logistical task site. There, people are going there to do a thing and probably bringing back their haul elsewhere. There is groundstone. So people are doing other things there for sure. But anybody worth their salt isn't going to go, to buy one nail at the hardware store when you may need 5. You're right. You're going to get 5. So you're going to do other things while you're out and about. So what's next for this research and this project? Again, Scott Miller, definitely a hunting site. My conclusion from that is based almost entirely on the projectile points. So I think we need to bring in more of the collection, and talking with Meg about some ways to think about that, particularly with the spatial analysis. I think getting spatial data on some of those other tool types, the groundstone and the flake tools and the pottery, and see where those are in relation to projectile points. Pottery, we can get some time control on. Groundstone, it could be 500 years old, it could be 5,000 years old, it could be 12,000 years old. We just don't know. That's pretty hard. Another big takeaway that may not land as much with this crowd and you folks tonight, but to my professional colleagues out there, use local and regional typologies and do the research. Chapin's dissertation came out in 2005. People continue to cite Irwin Williams, and again, her intent wasn't to do typology necessarily. She just was establishing these phases. And so think about regional and local typologies so we can start communicating on the same playing field about some of these things, and establishing patterns in areas like the San Luis Valley. And Scott Miller's really cool. It's a neat site, but there's other sites like it. This picture here that you see is of a site that we worked at in 2021. I mentioned at the beginning, and it's the Mr. Peat site. Very similar relic wetlands. You've got multiple layers of peat. There's bone, bison bone for sure, other animal bone, perhaps some mammoth tracks. It was a bit hard to say, but they were something. And the really cool thing about Mr. Peat is it's going to be a really nice contrast to Scott Miller, because we didn't find nearly any projectile points. We found some, but tons of groundstone, tons of other like rocks that weren't ground, but you look at that landscape, there's no way a rock gets there unless somebody brings it. So manuports, boiling stones perhaps, or they're caching things, right? That site furniture idea, that where you're leaving the tools you may need for future use there. So we're just burrowing into the analysis. We didn't do any. We just did 3 days of survey there, but collected some really nice data. And I'm excited to kind of compare and contrast those. And there's many more sites in the valley that are these relic wetlands, and not just in the valley. Marie Matsuda from Colorado State University, a recent graduate student there, did her her master's thesis on playa archaeology. Similar idea, right? These kind of semi-permanent, semi-stable landscapes where you're going to attract wildlife and game to a place. And as a hunter-gatherer, that's your bread and butter, man. That's what you want. So looking at some of these resource types rather than the archaeology itself, but using those to find the archaeology and talk about it, I think is a really important kind of next step for a lot of the places we work. So with that, just a couple closing notes. If you're interested in what I said, or you need some clarification, you're free, of course, to contact me. But we also, this report, like many of our reports, are up on our website, paleocultural.org/research. You can find the Scott Miller report there and dive into a little more detail than what I talked about. There's that picture that I mentioned, the San Luis Valley. It's I talk to people, I'm going to go work in the valley, and they're like, oh, it's dry and dusty down there. But it's not. It's a really dynamic, awesome landscape. This is on the Rio Grande Natural area, and it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. Who wouldn't want to float down that river or hang out on the shore and do some fishing? So that's the RGNA area on the south end of the valley. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the San Luis Valley, its geology, ecology, human history, it's a really fascinating place. This is a recent book out from the University Press of Colorado by Jared Beaton, edited by Gerald Beaton and Nick Sains and Benjamin Waddell, and they chapters on all sorts of things, from like the best rock climbing in the San Luis Valley to the geology of the San Luis Valley and everything in between. So it's a really neat book. There's a chapter in there by our PCRG's research director, Mark Mitchell, has a chapter with Angie Kral about the American Indian archaeology and occupation of the San Luis Valley. It's a great resource. And lastly, a bit of a shameless plug for us, Paleoculture Research Group, PCRG. We're a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We bring together students. We have work study students that work for us, the public, folks like you, our members, our research partners, Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, the whole state of Colorado, state of North Dakota. And we get everybody together and we go do research projects in the summer. So if you are interested in getting out in the field and trying archaeology or doing archaeology, look us up, paleocultural.org. The website's right there. My email address is right there. And we also manage a site that I give a little plug to, archaeologycolorado.org. It's a resource we're trying to revamp a little bit, but it's got a bunch of different resources about Colorado archaeology on there. So with that, my time is up, but I am happy to entertain any questions. Let me minimize so I can see Katie, and thanks for your time. Appreciate everybody coming.
And comments in the chat if you want to go through and address this at some point. I think if anybody has questions, you're welcome to either raise your hand, Chris can call on you, or just a free flow discussion.
Yeah, let me look through the chat here. Kelton scheduled for May. Okay, great. Yeah, tune in. It's he's got some really cool, neat stuff. So you guys will get a kick out of that. And he's a really good speaker, really good guy. So Chris Kearns, any plans, thoughts on doing some geophysics at the site along with targeted excavation? No plans currently, but you wouldn't have to twist my arm very hard to go do. I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. I think geophys could be useful. I think potentially a problem with some of that would be the changing landscape. That DEM map, the digital elevation model base layer on many of those maps, just showed how dynamic that landscape is. There's been a lot of recent and semi-modern modification to it. That's why it's dried up. Because I failed to mention that, but it was probably a number of factors. They rechannelized some things, I think, and changed the hydrology that fed that. But also in the valley itself, a lot of these playas and places that once were lush and teeming with game are no longer, because intensive agriculture has just dropped the water table down there to the point where it just can't keep up anymore and sustain those types of landscapes. So geophys, particularly like GPR, ground penetrating radar, might be pretty tough. But certainly doing some targeted excavations, really the only excavations there were by Steve Holland and Jared Beaton. So I think there's certainly more to do.
Yeah, I was thinking some mag survey. See if you could spot any hearth features or any kind of particular things going along with the hunting that's going on there. Stocking needs, activity areas that are not showing up with your surface collection, and that would be what I'd be hoping for out of a geophys survey, and not.
Yeah, I mean, we, as you know, Chris, PCRG, we use magnetometry a fair bit, mostly in village sites in North Dakota. But mag can be awesome. There is probably a fair bit of metal out there, which would make things kind of blow out. But I think the place to go, a lot of the work has been kind of in the peat and right on the peat. But one thing I noticed at Mr. Peat, the site we did in 2021, where there was a lot on the margins, a lot more variability in terms of artifact content on the margins, just outside of the peat. So I don't know how much has been done. I wasn't involved in any of the field work for Scott Miller, so I can't say for certain where they did and didn't look. But I'd be interested in expanding out away from the margins to think about that idea of like camp areas, right? As you wouldn't, no one in their right mind would camp in the middle of a peat bog, right? But so that's where I would go, and geophys magnetometry survey for sure there would be great. Chris, I won't repeat that, Chris. This is being recorded.
That's when you said that the concentration was by the parking area.
Yeah, I got you. Sure. Yeah. Is that real? Maybe. Again, like I said, I think if you spent every time you visited walking over every piece of that landscape, you'd probably come up with a similar distribution. But calling that like a concentration versus elsewhere may not work. Yeah. And Kern's, your question about the distribution with site formation and exposure processes, 100%. Yeah, I mean that's anywhere, but it is a dynamic landscape even today. There's shifting sands. That's another thing I noticed at Mr. Pete. These sand sheets that are moving back and forth. That one thing, one day is there and the next it's not. We found a little hearth feature at Mr. Pete that, if the wind had blown a slightly different direction, slightly harder the day before, we wouldn't have seen it. It was just some rocks barely poking out of the surface that we just recognized as a feature.
Makes that targeted excavation seem more worthwhile, because if you have stuff that's just slightly buried and dynamic landscape, you want to be able to understand how things are becoming visible.
Totally. Yeah. Not a problem or a counter necessarily, but the size of that site, where do you target your excavation? Without some other method to key it in, it would be a pretty big operation. But that wouldn't,
if you were here, you'd do a bunch of test pit surveying,
Yeah, that's an option too, for sure.
But I'm not saying I advocate for that method, but every survey is done here, test pit survey, so I'm getting used to that as the way everything is found, is through a test pit survey. which is a whole different process to me.
So let's see, Chris. The northern edge was plowed. Yeah, there's been a ton of landscape modification. That's my fault. I missed talking about kind of the history, that piece of the history. We don't know exactly what went on there, or at least I don't know exactly what went on there. But you just look at that elevation model map, and it's pretty clear there's been a fair bit of recent to near recent modification to that landscape. No doubt. Yeah. Yep. Katie Wechter, I'd like to hear more about land use, cover, recreation, known, suspected, collecting history. Yeah, me too. No, I can speak a little bit to that. There's a pretty well-known collector in the valley, and he came out in 2012 when the RMC team was out there, and there's some pictures of him, and he definitely had collected there, no doubt. At least my understanding of it, and he's one of many, probably. So, and it was a pastime. It was a thing he did in the valley, and it's hard to be well. It's really easy to be critical of it now, but at the time, that was just what you did, and so I think there's I try not to be super critical of that. It's unfortunate, certainly, that things are now in an artifact frame somewhere with no context. But it was just how things were back then. Certainly, I think a fair bit of collecting occurred there, just like elsewhere in the valley. And that Mr. Pete site, the whole reason we know about Mr. Pete was collectors talking about it on Facebook, and then archaeologists kind of keying in and going, whoa, wait a second. So, yeah. Obi Oberder, love to hear more about possible mammoth and other animal tracks in the San Luis. Yeah. So the ones we documented was the other crew chief, wasn't me. So I just got to see pictures of them, but I don't know. They're neat. They're interesting looking. But there are, many other track sites, and Jared Beaton has got a few things. I mentioned him. He was at Mr. Pete, but also, he's at Scott Miller, but has done a few other projects, and he talks a lot about mammoth sites in the valley in that book that I put up at the very end. Not necessarily mammoth tracks, though. I couldn't actually explicitly answer that question off the top of my head. I'd have to
follow up. What is the geology there of those tracks? Do you know? Are those like in volcanic tuff or
in the peat?
In the peat. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. So in the if that's what they are, they're in the peat. So you've got soft, squishy sediment that a mammoth may have walked through and left a mark, and then walked on, and then it dried up. And again, OB, just to clarify.
Yeah, about the raw material types. You said that most of the Oshara were obsidian and basalt.
They're a variety, a mixture of things, and in the report that you can get online, it'll tell you material type by series type, but the majority of them are volcanics, obsidian, dacite, which is a kind of another glassy material, basalt. There's other materials, certainly. There's some quartzites and cherts, but my point was most of them are from southern sources or western sources.
Yeah, I just spent a lot of the summer and fall doing a cultural landscape survey in the southwest of there in Archuleta Mesa and down in the Jicarilla. And that it had a really similar raw material type spectrum with just the occasional kind of northern quartzite So that's why I was seeking clarification on that. I think it's interesting. I think there's a connection there.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the materials, the raw materials in the valley, are there's kind of a north-south contrast, but on the central southern end of the valley it tends to be a lot of volcanics, a lot of obsidian and dacite and basalt. A lot of people have been calling things basalt, but they're actually probably dacite. Just it's another black rock. Some guy named Spencer Pelton has a question.
Hey, Chris. Good talk.
What's up, buddy? Thanks, man.
I'm completely unfamiliar with the Oshara tradition. This is kind of the first time I'm hearing of it. But it's kind of like our Archaic on the High Plains, right? It's like post-groundstone adoption, pre-pottery. Is that more or less kind of how it's defined?
Yeah, it's roughly equivalent to the Archaic. It's just the local, the regional sequence.
So are there sites in the Southwest where the sequence of these different projectile point styles have been defined really well, like in a stratified context, or has this just been kind of cobbled together through dated context, or like how is this chronology actually built to the extent that you feel confident like relying on it as temporal markers?
Yeah, mostly the latter of what you said. They're have to burrow in a little harder and think about it, but it's more. There's a few sites that have portions of it. I'm not sure if there's any one site that has all of it. Chapin, in his dissertation and then in the book, kind of more accessible, he has a few sites in the Rio Grande region that has some decent sequence of these, but then a lot of the dates are kind of cobbled together from multiple sites and multiple portions of kind of the central northern New Mexico. So it is, that's remains the problem. I think one of the main problems with the Oshara tradition. I don't think it's a limiting factor on using it, but it certainly would be nicer to have more and better dated sites for this, particularly parsing out some of how Chapin does it with his types within series. That to me was a bit problematic, and that's why I kind of reversed it and just went back to the generalized series type, which uses all of those dates, but you're not pigeonholing yourself so much. So, but it is roughly equivalent to the Archaic, Plains Archaic. And I have some chapters. If you want to read more, I'm happy to send them to you.
Sure.
All right. Did I answer everybody's question in the chat room? The chat room. What is this, 2005?
Yeah. Clearly a millennial.
2005.
Yeah, right. Probably like 1999.
I was like 1995, but whatever.
Yeah. Are there any other questions before we close out for the evening? All right.
Great.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, everyone. Appreciated it.
Yeah, thanks. It was really, really interesting.
If you want to catch a replay, Crow Canyon will be presenting.
Oh.
Well, you'll be presenting, Chris, but Crow Canyon is hosting a similarly named presentation. What day?
Yeah, if you want to relive the glory, it'll be happening a week from today.
Nice. At 4 p.m.
At 4 p.m. Yes. Because some people got to get to bed, so I wanted to,
It's late here now. It's like
Yeah.
10:30, so
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Getting
Well-
past bedtime almost, but thank you, Chris. Much appreciated.
For sure. Yeah, good seeing you, Chris. It's been too long. Nice to see you, man.
Of course.
All right.
Right.
Do I stop presenting?
It doesn't, that you can, yeah. To exit, you just push the red hang up button.
There you go.
Yeah, to hang up. Sure.
All right. Well, good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Night, Chris and Chris.